I'm thrilled to lead off today's incredible day of panel sessions with a topic that I think has really dominated the news media and society in the last year, although it is far from a new topic, sexual harassment. Obviously, it did not start in the entertainment industry, and today we'll be talking about a piece of work about sexual harassment in medicine and science and engineering that is really historic in its scope, in its depth, in its extensive reach. And I am thrilled to share the stage with really two legends in medicine and science. You have their bios in the app. They really don't need an introduction, but I wanted to highlight a couple of their incredible accomplishments. It could literally fill the hour, but Dr. Paula Johnson is the 14th president of Wellesley College. Prior to that, Dr. Johnson was the chief of the Division of Women's Health at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. She is a cardiologist and professor of epidemiology with the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And Dr. Johnson was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and I could go on and on and on. So not our first time together at an event like this, but certainly a tremendous honor. And then Dr. Victor Zhao is the president of the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. Prior to that, Dr. Zhao was the CEO and president of the Duke University Health System, past chair of the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's as well in Boston and Stanford. You've lived in some amazing places. You have done incredible work and research, as you both have, so it's thrilling to be up here with you. I want to set up the background for what Dr. Johnson and Dr. Zhao will be talking about today, because I'm sure you're all aware that recently the National Academy of Sciences has published a 311-page document, which is literally right there. It is 2 years in the making. It just came out, and it represents the scope of the problem that we have in the area of science and medicine and engineering regarding sexual harassment. A statistic that I was unaware of that I found staggering is that the sexual harassment in science and medicine is second only to that of the military in its rate. And so I want to go through the who, what, why, when, where, and how, and also hopefully, Drs. Johnson and Zhao will give you an idea where we're going in the future. So, Dr. Zhao, we can't ever understand where we are today without some historical context and background. So if you could explain some of that to us and why the National Academy of Sciences undertook this massive study.
Thank you. First, I want to say good morning to all of you. Good morning. All right. I also want to thank the Aspen Institute for really taking on this topic, the first one, right, kicking off the entire spotlight, because it's so important. And of course, for me, it's just great privilege and honor to be with Paula, a good friend for many years. I thought what I'll do is I'll explain to you a little bit of who we are, very short, and why we end up doing this very important study. The National Academy of Science, Engineering, Medicine are three academies where we've come together over the years under the same umbrella because we want to tackle really important issues. Traditionally, we've done more around policy in science, in medicine, but increasingly, we're recognizing there's so many important social issues, this being one of them. So when we get together, we look at what's important to the nation, what's important globally. And this study is interesting because you think about Me Too and how this is really changing the dialogue and activating and making people aware of the pervasiveness of sexual harassment. Our report is timely because it's coming out about the same time, but actually the conversation began well over 2 years ago. At the National Academies, we have a committee of women in science, engineering, medicine. And that group, which is found 3 decades ago, has been trying to look at how to advance women in science, engineering, and medicine. It's a tough field. We make progress, but this committee that's ongoing started over 2 years ago saying, you know, what we're seeing is people leaving the profession because of sexual harassment issues like this. Maybe it's much bigger than we imagined. Hence the idea of creating a study, which we're so happy that Paula co-chaired and led this very important study report. And as you hear, I guess some of us would say no surprise, and many of us would say great surprise. This really happens in academia, happens in engineering, science, and especially in medicine. You hear about some of the findings. But I think our commitment as an academy to this issue is really, really strong. You hear how we're really working with Paula and our staff to make sure that this report is not only sitting with people in academia, but the public. And not only that, it's not only a report on the shelf, but we want to see action. And so that's why we did all those things. So I just want to set the stage for how we come about doing this. One last thing. A study like this, you saw the 300 and whatever page report, as Paula would tell you, takes us well over a year with multiple meetings, and eventually we have to get,
2 years.
2 years, yeah. And so we take this very seriously. What's unique about our report, National Academies, is that our recommendations are formal, and of course, as I told Jennifer, many of them end up in Congress, many end up with the agencies. So in fact, policies are being made based on report. So over to you.
So Paula, as we say in media, we don't want to bury the lead. Share with us, if you could, the findings and what are the recommendations, and if you could give the top 3 things that stood out to you in terms of findings.
No, that's great. And Victor, I just want to thank you because honestly, this was a tremendous honor to co-chair this report. And it's very powerful. I do just want to emphasize to have all 3 academies, medicine, science, and engineering, come together to say together, this is a problem that we really want to tackle, and we want to tackle head on. Right. And so, myself, along with my co-chair, Sheila Widnall, a professor at MIT, and we had 21 members of the committee from across the fields, and also some very, very strong leaders, the leaders in the social science field who study this area. And there really are, it's not a huge area of study, but we really had the best. So I think just to set the stage, we really looked at the full definition of sexual harassment. And that includes sexual coercion, which is kind of the quid pro quo, sleep with me if you want X. Mm-hmm. Then there's unwanted sexual attention, whether that's verbal, nonverbal, kind of the things that kissing, touching, all the way to assault. And then the much larger area that is far more pervasive is gender harassment. And as one of our members likes to put it, they are the put-downs as opposed to the come-ons. So, words or statements, interactions that make women feel as if they don't belong, unwanted, calling of names, unwanted or sexualized pictures in the environment. And it really is that area is, as I said, far more pervasive and sets the stage for the 2 other forms of sexual harassment that we tend to think about when we think about sexual harassment. So we looked at the full scope. We came out really believing from the evidence that it is critical to address all 3. And what does that mean? It means that, number 1, we have to, address sexual harassment in our environments in a way that makes it clear what our policies are. Leadership is critical. So policies that include diversity, inclusion, and respect at all levels are critical. Policies regarding sexual harassment and how it will be handled need to be clear and articulated to everyone in an institution. Second is that we tend in academia, as in most institutions, tend to approach sexual harassment from a very legalistic standpoint. It's really much more about how we avoid liability as opposed to how we really, 1, support the targets or the victims, or 2, how we actually change the culture. So, we focused on the data on how do you do those things? How do you, 1, create better ways of supporting victims, whether they report or not? A lot of our policies having to do with Title IX and Title VII, two very important laws, but what they have translated into is the assumption that women will come forward. And we know today that that is not the case. Women are fearful of retaliation, and they have a good reason to be fearful of retaliation because retaliation is common. So we need to figure out ways and determine ways to support the victims, to develop strategies, to provide mental health, career services, and other services for victims. We also have to allow victims to have control over how they proceed with how they're going to come forward. So how they're going to document whether or not various actions have been occurring and when they will report. It's a whole nother area that we can talk about later. And most importantly, we really have to, one, understand our institutions. We have to do high-quality surveys. Those surveys are not present today. There's one that we used in our report called ARC3 that's used in colleges and universities for undergraduates. Nothing exists like that for faculty or staff. And second, we really have to change the culture. And what does that mean? It's hard work. It takes leadership. Again, inclusion, diversity, respect at all levels. We've got to change the power dynamic as well. In so many areas, we have a male-dominated hierarchy. In order to really address this culture problem, we have to change that hierarchy. And in so many fields, in science, engineering, and medicine, that's been the case. And we have to really think about, again, in science, engineering, and medicine, this hierarchy between advisor and advisee, mentor and mentee, is one that is problematic, or can be problematic. You have a junior person who is frequently fully dependent on an advisor or mentee or principal investigator. And how do we change that dynamic? And we give some recommendations around that.
So, Paula, you brought up many points, but two that I want to do a deeper dive on. One is changing the culture from a bi-directional approach, because I think it's very easy when we hear about sexual harassment to want to target the person doing the harassing. And what you spoke to, especially on the much more inferior, dependent junior level, and obviously at even the undergraduate level, but certainly in medical school, in postgraduate training, is very difficult to change that culture. There was a statistic in the study that also blew me away, that upwards of 40% of medical students have been subjected to sexual harassment. For me personally, in my medical career, it happened twice. Once was when I was a fourth-year medical student at Columbia going on my residency interviews. I sat in an interview with a very prominent chair of OBGYN at a New York City hospital who asked me, not once, but twice, how exactly I was going to do a residency while being a mother to two babies. Mm-hmm. And I actually thought he meant in an esoteric way. And I said, I want to be in the moment, and just, wherever I am, I'm going to be in the moment. And he said, no, I mean, literally, how will you do a residency and take care of your children? And from that position, and I'd like both of you to just briefly address how you will start to address this from that fourth-year medical student person. I sat there and thought, this person could end me. He could, forget about not getting a residency at this place, he could pick up the phone to 5 other top places that I'm applying to and say, don't take this person. She's a troublemaker. And I'm embarrassed to say that even though this was 18 years ago, I caved. I had zero intention of doing anything but answering him, to the point. I think I've gotten that figured out. Thank you, sir. And moving on. But how do you change that culture for someone who has no power?
Yeah. So, it's not an easy answer. And I think that we do have to start with leadership at the top. So we have to have leadership in medicine that is making clear what the expectations are, what these behaviors are, and what are the consequences for them. And from the bottom up, now you were applying, but in institutions to also educate those who are trainees and at the lower end of the scale to understand actually what sexual harassment is. Because what we found is that there are many women who don't fully understand what harassment is. And in fact, it's important in terms of surveys, because if you say, have you been a victim of or a target of sexual harassment, you will have women say no, but when you outline the behaviors, the
Correct.
numbers don't match.
I would have said, well, he was a chauvinist.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have said that was harassment. But Victor, let's extend a little bit to the male-female issue. I think so often we hear about sexual harassment, and this is part of changing the culture. I'm sure we all agree. We think male harassing female. Speak a little bit about when the man is the victim.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd like to first go back to the culture issue. I think culture is what you believe in, the value of your system. So as Paula said, it will take a long time to build. However, it's got to do with the climate by which you live, right? Sure. So leadership is important because you want leaders to believe and being able to engage with people to make the changes. But also importantly is grassroots effort. Sure. To know there's bi-directional effort together. But you know, when you think about culture, you think about what you do every single day, what you believe in. So you have to avoid being too top-down, saying thou shalt not do this or that. At the same time, you want to have clear policies and things you abide by, transparency, accountability, which I think that we have failed in many ways in academia in having that transparency, et cetera. As Paula said, you know, we should do surveys, but I think we should have annual reports of
Yes.
what's going on within your university, what's going on within your medical school, et cetera. And then we should be able to actually act on the things we believe in. But it will take a long time for this to change. So talking about male-dominated, we call profession, if you will. In medicine, when you look at medical school, over 50% are women. But when you go up the ladder to assistant professor, some 40%. You go all the way to the top professor, that's about a 15, 18%. So you can see the attrition, and therefore we have really more or less set up for a male-dominated society. So first question we ask ourselves, why is this the case? And what do we need to do about this, right? So back to your question, I believe that, of course, sexual harassment happens in both ways. But in our current environment, it's more male because it's dominated by male leadership. In medicine, Paula and I can tell you how hierarchical our structure is, which gives people on the top real power. And I just gave you some numbers in terms of how this is a male-dominated. But also, it is a profession that really believes in a grueling, hard work, experience. And Paula, I think one of your respondents says that training is constantly violating human rights. So
why not this one?
Yeah, why not this one, right? So I think that's where we need to do is to really change that. That also includes a changing of the ratio. And the question is, why are not women at the leadership? Clearly, look at Paula and others, that they are some of the best leaders. Why aren't there more of them? I think that's not only part of the culture, but we also need to remove the structural barriers that creates this problem.
So we know what the benefits are of minimizing / eliminating sexual harassment in the sciences. What are the risks? What are the risks? Paula, I'll let you take the institution, and then Victor to the individual.
Sure.
So I just do want to respond to, add on Victor's last answer, because it's something that I just want to make sure that we talk about, which is, as we think about that hierarchy and we think about the lack of women in that hierarchy, what we also found was that women of color, racial and ethnic minorities, as well as sexual minorities, were actually more at risk. And if you think about who is present in the leadership hierarchy, that is a minority of minorities. So I think it's important to understand that this isn't a monolith, that it is, we've got to look at various groups, measure to understand how we're making impact. Sure. But the impact on institutions and, quite frankly, on science is profound. If we think about, let's just talk about the environment in which sexual harassment occurs. What we know today is it can be one-on-one, but it can also be ambient. And when it is witnessed by bystanders, so others in a lab, in a practice, in a group, in the OR, the other, what we say bystanders, really are impacted. And we have good data. So the women who are impacted across all three realms experience higher rates of depression, anxiety. They also recede from the profession. They either stop taking advantage of opportunities or they drop out.
Right.
And the same for the bystanders. So there's for sure impact in terms of culture with regard to not only the target, but the entire environment.
And to be clear, that environment literally is all of us.
It's all of us.
If that person can't contribute, it's all of us.
It is really all of us. And then the other important thing is, what is the impact to science and medicine? And, we now have more and more women entering these fields. They're also dropping out or receding. That's a loss. It's a loss to the fields that they are entering. It's a loss to science. It's a loss to the integrity of research and science. So I think the impact is profound. We actually tried to get a robust economic study of this because we wanted to understand the impact economically. Unfortunately, the data just are not really there to do that. It's something that we should be doing, but it's quite significant.
May I expand on that a little bit? Because when I look at those numbers, while you have 50% of, if you look at that moving up the ladder, I think a lot of people, we put a lot of attribution to work-life balance, issues like that, but I think a lot of people drop out of the profession, at least the academia hierarchy, because it is so hostile to success. And so, as Paula said, the report says we're really losing good people. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that committee of women in science, engineering, medicine starts seeing we have the pipeline now, but what happened along the way?
Right.
And I think this is a big factor, one of them. So I was mentioning to you, when I got to Stanford in 1990, I remember there was a very famous case, a neurosurgeon by the name of Frances Connolly. Fran Connolly was the first woman in the United States to be tenured in neurosurgery professorship at Stanford. She actually resigned just when I got there because she said the entire department's atmosphere was sexist and what we would today call gender harassment, right? And in order for her to be heard, she had to resign. And she was a high visible individual, which actually got national headlines. And we talk about this 40 years later, right? So I think this is a big issue. People need to be able to speak up. And I think, as you were saying, people are really intimidated of speaking up. The environment in this dependent ratio or relationship, say if I run a lab, the student that works under me is highly dependent on both funding from me and promotion, evaluation. So that relationship sets the stage, just like in medicine as well. If I'm the senior attending and I'm watching how you are performing, I'm going to evaluate you. And the way that medicine like to teach is to quick fire at you and see how you respond. That pressure is amazing. So it's very intimidating. I think to begin with, these things have to change.
Right. What about the risks to the individual? And go through, both of you, if you could, the specific action steps that you hope will be implemented across the board, either institution to institution or in science and engineering and medicine in general. So, if you are a student at a high schools, boarding schools, most colleges have very clear disciplinary algorithm. you get caught with this offense, you get brought to this committee, second offense, you're out. Walk us through, if you can, what you hope will be implemented in terms of sexual.
Well, I want to share an experience with you. When I was chair of medicine back in Boston with Paula, we had a very prominent scientist who was also a division chief. And he was accused of, by multiple people, women, of sexual harassment. So, as chair, we went through a very careful investigation. And of course, there was truth to this. How do we handle this? This issue got so interested that the head of university was interested in this issue. I got called from the president's office to say, how are we handling this? And I think that we started from a position of, say, how do we protect the institution from liability and reputation, right? So eventually, we got him to resign. But part of the resignation agreement with his lawyer is non-disclosure. I think that's got to change. As you can imagine, that we really pretty much turfing the issue to somebody else as we protect our organization. Now, good things came out from it, Paula will tell you, because we appointed a leading women scientist, changed the entire division. But I think that the way that we handle then, and still now, a lot of this, is that we need to be transparent. We need to be able to say, if you really violate this, we are going to take action. And that we should be sticking by this and not try to sweep it under the rug. I think that's one of the important area of
But why do you both think that the primary concern is to protect the institution? When you talk about the paradigm shift here that we're trying to achieve, why couldn't it be the exact opposite? Look how great the institution is to jump on this. And
I think Victor's example is the way it has been, and in many ways, the way it is today. We both, I mean, looking forward, that paradigm needs to shift. And it needs to shift at every level. So we need to have a clear set of policies that match the offense. And they need to be transparent and articulated. We need to understand, even our approach to training is very legalistic. Go on a website and do some training. And basically, what we know today, there's still a lot of work to be done. Training's got to be in person. It's got to be at least several hours. It is not about changing beliefs. It's about changing behavior. And we also need to have leadership involved. How do we also think about supporting, again, the targets or the victims of harassment? Reporting needs to be looked at as an act of courage. It is an act of courage, and it needs to be supported, and we need to protect any victim or target from retaliation. And that's got to be a basic fundamental principle. And then we need a set of policies, and in the report, we've made a series of recommendations to Congress, actually, on this. And one of them addresses this issue of making illegal these confidentiality agreements. I like to think about it as, think about the Catholic Church. We really cannot be secret. This is our responsibility. And I think that if we begin to really look at all of the above and changing that power dynamic, and there are some fundamental things we can do. Mentor networks, thinking about diffusing that intense dependency financially with PIs and trainees. And then lastly, I'm going to say something about research and the structure of research, because another recommendation that we've made is, we have federal funders. And today, there is no requirement for reporting with regard to those who have been found in violation of sexual harassment policies. Now, this would take some thinking, because at what level do you report, et cetera, but we really feel strongly that we really need to think about our federal agencies taking a stand on this and sexual harassment being considered as serious as research misconduct and taking it very seriously. And we believe that if you begin to kind of make the consequences and implications, quite profound in terms of funding, that also helps move the needle.
And just clarify, if you will, Paula, what those consequences of research misconduct are for people
Well,
who
you
might
know,
not
it
be
is what we've talked about, the toxic work environment, people dropping out, science not having the benefit of.
And also, but I mean, what happens when someone in academia is accused of
Today,
research
there's no
misconduct?
requirement. There is no requirement for reporting to a federal agency. And, you know, that's something that really would require legislation. And, you know, it's an important area, though.
Actually, National Science Foundation is now requiring those reporting, right? So the question is, what do you do with it?
Right.
So people can argue, look, we are funding science. So we look at how good their science is. We're not funding conduct. Right. So this is where we need to cross that kind of bridge to understand that the code of conduct is important. You're a professional. You represent not only how well you do in science, but your entire profession and your reputation. And the integrity of science is dependent on integrity of personal behavior, because you heard how people are driven out of science, how you're losing talent, and possibly I would expect that relationship sometimes encourages misconduct even in science.
Yeah.
So that's got to stop. So I think back to the issue of transparency. I think transparency has got to be the answer to the question.
Right.
Paula also mentioned this whole idea of power diffusion, that is taking out from the hand of one person and put it around a lot more. She said about mentorship. But I think that leadership in institutions, more than Congress, need to first take this on seriously. Mm-hmm. They need to find a way to fund these young people so they're not wholly dependent on one individual, but the institution gives them that protection.
Yeah.
I think those are some of the things that we can do.
Yeah. Can I just add
yes.
one quick thing? Because Victor mentioned the professions, and there's very good data as well that many of the professional societies are taking this on, creating very strong codes of conduct. A lot of misconduct occurs at meetings and other places, and also creating codes that apply to field sites. You could almost imagine an academic medical center being a type of field site. And maybe this is why some of the levels of harassment are higher as well. But we have seen from data that on field sites, so geoscience, astroscience, some of those levels are 60% of those in those fields are experiencing sexual harassment. So lots of work to do. And once again, it's not just, it's got to start with our institutions, but there are a lot of other factors that can play into changing culture.
I've two quick questions. My job's to keep the train on the track, and then I'm going to open it up to you all for about 10 minutes of Q&A, so get your questions ready. One, quickly, how do you think medicine and science compares to business law in terms of this issue? My opinion is that those professions are a lot more welcoming and inclusive to women than medicine and science is. Do you agree? If not, and why do you think that is? And then the last question is, where do you hope this issue is in 3, 5, 10 years?
I think that this is a problem for our entire society. Mm-hmm. This is a problem probably for all professions and sectors. The question is, how well are we measuring it? Do we have a systematic way of measuring every company? How do we, are people reporting this? So I don't know how to answer this. We do know we have a real problem in academia, right? We can measure that easily because of the way we're structured between trainees and faculty and leadership, et cetera. And of course, in the business world, it's somewhat different. My impression, of course, is that in business, there's still a problem. I mean, even you could look at Silicon Valley and what you hear about in Silicon Valley. You would think that these companies are so progressive, full of young people who are innovators, and yet they still experience a big problem. Sure. So I don't really know how to answer your question except to say we need to take this really seriously everywhere.
Yeah. And be less siloed. And
be less, and what I would say, just building on what Victor said, is I think, you know, the academies took this on to get the best data. So, right, we have now seen the best data. We know where the holes are. We know where we have a very good sense of a roadmap. And we've actually recommended that the NIH and NSF take this on in 3 to 5 years to understand where we are, what progress have we made, because it's not just good enough, and there's some plans in the making to do that work. But what I would say to other professions, because again, I haven't seen the evidence, you hear the reports, and I know a large number of women who dropped out of those professions. What they need to do is take the lead, as we did, to say, how do we actually gather the best evidence? And if we don't have it, let's find it, because this is a major problem.
Right. And to be clear, medicine and science has done that before a lot of other professions. So.
Before you open, I just want to say one thing. First of all, we're taking this issue very seriously. So it's not just a report. We want to make sure that report turns into action. And so we have an extensive plan to be sure that this report doesn't sit on the shelf, but gets discussed at the leadership level, academia, gets discussed everywhere. I want to give a shout out to Fraser Benya. She's a staff here. She told me this is the beginning of a roadshow. And so we are really going to different places, different societies. But importantly, on June 26th, we have a major meeting in California. It's about 500 people. Anita Hill's going to speak at this meeting as well. We have one in November, which we're going to have a massive meeting, right? And we're going to have people who all sign on to say this is important. And we will have, of course, social media. And many of you know there's hashtag Science2. The conversation, Me Too, is happening everywhere. We want to create the same space for academia.
So we need to get you a bus. We need to wrap the bus.
There you go.
Fraser, for the national cross-country tour. Obviously, this is something we could talk about endlessly, but I would like to open it to you. We have microphones, so just put your hand up. Let's start over there.
Thank you very much for this. Patty Gabbo from Denver. I wonder if you could comment about the link between money and the fact that many of the healthcare institutions are focusing on maximizing their revenue. And how does that link to changing the culture? I would posit that it has two effects. One is that if you're a high earner in a medical institution, either clinical earnings or grant earnings, you're very protected. And institutions really hesitate to move against you because of their focus on maximizing revenue. And the second component of it, I believe, gets to what Dan talked about at the opening session about the dignity of everyone. And if the institution isn't giving the message that everyone has dignity, it's a problem. And I think they give that message when they block admissions to uninsured and Medicaid patients and vulnerable people. And both of those are the link between the culture and the drive for maximizing revenue. So could you talk about how that link has to be broken if we're going to deal with this problem?
I guess it's for me. Patty, I think there's a great series of questions. It's not just money. If you look at a famous researcher, right, it's not so much grants you bring in, but it gives the institution great reputation of scientific discovery, you name it. So it's about power, it's about impact, and money, of course, counts. And I quite agree with you that my observation is, those surgeons or whatever specialty who actually are famous doctors who bring a lot of patients in, people try to tiptoe around them a little bit more, and I think that's got to change, right? Your point about why we're here in medicine, why we're here in science, is for the good of the nation, good of our people, and we got to remain true to those value and the mission, and make sure that we don't let other things, kind of pull away from our true values. So I totally agree with you. This is what we meant by changing the culture. The culture starts from the top, but also need to be involving everybody from bottom as well. Yeah. And I think everybody who goes to medicine all want to do the right thing. So therefore, it's probably not that difficult if people in the top understand those issues and start making those changes.
Yep. It also has implications for the way that we choose leadership. I do think, it is a matter of values, how those values get articulated, but not just articulated, how they are lived out every day in an institution, and modeling how they are lived out. Because just like the earliest medical student, if behavior is not modeled for that person, they really don't understand. Yep. So how is that modeled from the bottom up and the top down? And how do we choose leadership and make it clear what our expectations are from leadership? And we have been moving in that direction. It's not just scientific productivity or clinical excellence or the amount of grant money, but there's a whole dimension of leadership and what we value that also needs to be infused in that.
Yeah. So Paul and I both came from the same institution. You think about people who are into global health, health equity. These are not people bringing lots of money in. Yeah. Paul Farmer, Jim Kim, and look at what they've been able to do. So I think institutions do recognize this. But Patty, to your point, we need to make sure that we don't drag in one direction and break that kind of issue that you mentioned.
Thank you for that question. Over there, just.
I'm Kurt Malkoff. I'm a PhD clinical psychologist whose company provides employee-based services to hospitals and colleges and what have you all over the country. And clearly, we probably could have saved you 3 years. We could have told you that this is a rampant problem. What I'm speaking to is what you've talked around, and it's the issue of institutional courage. How does Wellesley, how does your organization demonstrate that institutional courage? Because to Paula's point, it takes a lot of courage for a victim to stand up, third-year resident, whoever we're talking about, and make a claim, against somebody in power. How do your institutions speak to that?
Well, I can tell you personally at Wellesley, I'm very fortunate in that our faculty are 52% women, so that begins to change the dynamic. But we're very purposeful in ensuring, even with 52%, how do we consider equity and inclusion as we think about leadership trajectories and leadership roles? And then it's really about values. And I do think, how do you embody in your own decision-making every single day with my leadership team, with the heads of academia, the provosts and the deans? This is something that has to be lived. It's living those values. And, I don't think there's a formula, but I can tell you that in the way we make decisions, how we make those decisions, and how we think about victims or targets of sexual harassment who are coming forward and what that process is to support them says a lot about who you are. And when you have a supportive process, one that respects the dignity and the courage of those individuals and also deals with the actual perpetrator, you begin to set the stage for an understanding in an institution of how these issues will be addressed. It's different from this overarching zero tolerance as being the end all. We know that, yes, it might be important, but there's no proof that a pure zero tolerance standing alone really does anything. It is about how we live, behave, make decisions, and have policies that are lived every single day.
So my answer is from 2 points of view. I have run many different institutions, including at Duke. And so it's really leadership and believe in their values. So let me take, in the medicine world, patient safety as an example, right? We have had history in this country and everywhere else of many unsafe practices that lead to preventable death in hospital, et cetera. So the way that we shine a light on this, and I'll actually report from National Academies, and then follow up by understanding this is a system failure. You can't blame individual only, you need to change the entire system. So in so doing, when I was at Duke, we actually took it upon ourselves to be there every week to make what we call work rounds, to let people know this matters, the frontline people, et cetera. So that really is important, changing the entire culture everywhere. The National Academies, of course, we are a member organization. It's a little different. we elect our members, and if you look at across the 3 academies, we have like 400 Nobel laureates. Now, what we need to do is to be sure that we have a code of conduct, that we actually know what we'll be doing if our members violate any of the code of conduct. And that's what we're working on right now.
So I know I wish we had time for to keep the Q&A going, but unfortunately we don't. I would encourage you, all of you, to tweet. What's the hashtag, Victor? Science2. Science2. We can literally start that buzz for your roadshow here by getting this out there. Any of your comments?
And that is so important because it takes all of us. And I will tell you, as a college president, I am so impressed with the power of and advocacy of our students and for different groups. So no group should feel powerless in this.
Right. And we can literally start that on a big scope today when you leave here. So I want to thank everyone for getting up early. I hope you had a wonderful first panel. Of course, thank you to Victor Zhao and Paula Johnson for kicking off this day with such impressive work and a really, really important topic.
Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you.